everybody, Steven here with Neural DSP, and today I'm bringing you the guitar breakdown of the Artist Tone's Top 5 cover of John Mayer. And without wasting a single second, let's go ahead and just jump right into the breakdown. One of the biggest things that I want you guys to take away from this is that your guitars aren't going to sound exactly like mine. These presets are not going to sound exactly the same as when I'm playing them. So a couple of tips on how you guys can make these presets work for your own guitars is the first thing that I would do is adjust this input knob here at the top left of the plugins. This is going to affect the amount of saturation that each one of the gain knobs is going to have on your signal. So if you got some really hot pickups, or maybe you have some active EMGs, I would definitely suggest turning the input gain down. Now, if your pickups are particularly bright compared to mine, you can always adjust one of these tone knobs here in the pedal section, or you can pull up an EQ before the plugin so that way you can brighten up your tone with an EQ. With that being said, please, by all means, download the presets. They're in the description box. I would love to know your thoughts on them. So as I go through these presets, I'm not going to talk about each individual knob that I turn, but I am going to bring a couple of things to your guys' attention so you know the mindset on how I dialed in these presets. So let's start with the Vultures rhythm guitars. Now, I recorded these tracks with two different guitars. I recorded one with a Strandberg Classic 6 with a prototype set of pickups, and then I recorded the other guitar on an FGN Telecaster. So a couple of things I'll bring to your attention on these particular ones is the use of delay and reverb. Now, I didn't really want a delay and reverb that was going to kind of take over the mix. What I was looking for is mainly just to add just a little bit of space to the guitars. That way they kind of sit back more in the mix. So moving on to the pedal section, I ended up using the compressor to brighten up the tone pretty considerably. I used the neck pickup on the Strandberg for this particular rhythm section, so here's what it sounds like without the pedals on. And then the big rig overdrive is there to give a little bit of body and saturation to the tone. Now for this particular type of clean, I did go with the Clean Machine with its counterpart cab section, which I believe the Ribbon 121 is still in its default position because it just sounds awesome. All right, now moving along to the lead line. Now this is one that probably people didn't imagine that was going to be used during this particular playthrough. I ended up using the Fortin Cali. I used just the Zool just to keep the track clean. I didn't use the hex drive or the grind pedal, but I ended up using the Overdrive 1 with a combination of the Ribbon 121 and Dynamic 57. Now to get this track pretty bright, I ended up pushing the Ribbon 121 and the Dynamic 57 pretty close to the dust cap on the speaker cone. The real trick to this one was getting that somewhat saturated, kind of dry sound to it. Now moving along, I did use the Archetype Corey Wong for the delay and reverb. These are very similar settings to the delay and reverb that I used in the rhythm section. Again, just a little bit of touch of space, nothing more. I don't want it to be washing all over the place. After that, I pulled up Cornef Audio's Pawn Shop compressor with the wide solo preset, made a couple of adjustments just to keep the dynamics of the solo in place. Okay, so now we're gonna move on to Gravity. This is the first lead in the track, and I actually went with the archetype Corey Wong's DI Funk console. And the reason why I went with the DI Funk console is because in the studio track, this lead is actually pretty clean, and it's a little bit darker than some of the other guitar tracks that John Mayer has used. Now, I recorded this one on the Telecaster, just allowing for some of that neck pickup warmth to kind of come through. I did darken up the tone with the compressor as well as the Big Rig overdrive. And I also used the impulse responses counterpart to the DI Funk console with the Ribbon 121 just barely off of its default position. Now, the thing that I really enjoy about the tube saturation knob in the DI Funk console is that whenever you add saturation, it already adds an amount of compression to the signal that it's saturating. Now, I'll change the tube saturation so you can hear how it's going to be affecting the signal. So you can hear the tail end of that note is still present because of the added compression from the tube saturation knob. For those of you who really love the archetype Pliny, because I know there are a lot of you, I ended up using this one on the rhythm during Gravity. So my approach to the archetype Pliny is going to be very similar to the previous tracks where I have a little bit of compression. I turned down the gain on this one. The overdrive pedal is just giving a little bit of brightness, a little bit of saturation. I ended up using the second head and dynamic 57 and 160 for the impulse responses. When you take a look at the EQ, I add a nice bright shelf and dip out a little bit of the lows and low mids. Now for the delay and reverb, I do use a similar convention as the archetype Corey Wong. Very, very sparse amount of delay, very, very sparse amount of reverb, just to give it just a little bit of space. For the lead in Gravity, I wanted to try and replicate the same kind of tone that I got with the Fortin Cali. So I went with the Corey Wong's amp snob and then did just a couple of moves. I turned the fourth position compressor on and bumped up the tone, the compression, pulled back the volume just a little bit because I turned the drive switch on. To compensate for that, I ended up turning the volume and the input gain knob back so that way it didn't saturate too much while I hit the amp snob. So now I have the added benefit of using compression to keep my signal very stable and consistent, but then I also just get a tiny amount of saturation once it hits the drive in the amp snob. Now coming over to the effects, I did use the wash to give a nice kind of bloom of reverb. Okay, next up we get to Neon, and this was the track that took me the absolute longest to learn. Just as a side note, I learned all of these parts, started recording, and then scrapped all of it just so I could go back and woodshed because I was just not happy with how the inflection and the phrasing and the vibrato were sounding, so this took me a long time to do. Neon in particular was very difficult just because of the right hand technique, and trying to pull it off at least somewhat authentically took a bit to try and work out. So I ended up recording this one on the Telecaster and using the Fortin Cali as my amplifier. To get that sort of crunchy kind of distortion, I used the Fortin Grind to clean up some of the low end and to give it a little bit of just that sort of breakup sound. As with previous ones, I use the archetype Corey Wong's wash pedal to give it just a little bit of delay. So we go ahead and listen to this. You can hear when I turn on the grind pedal, it cleans up so much of that low end. I'm using the neck pickup on the Telecaster, so it makes it pretty low end heavy. So this grind is great for scooping all of that out, so that way the low end isn't taking up all of that headroom and soaking up all that saturation. And then it's become one of my favorite limiters is the Cornef Audio's Talkback limiter. Now, basically, it's just sitting there to make sure that nothing gets too out of hand, but I do like how it raises up the low end and kind of makes it a little bit more consistent. Now, towards the transition, I did duplicate my tracks, and then I put the wah pedal in front of the Fortin Cali. They're all pretty much the same settings. I just dialed in the individual parameters and automations so that way the wah pedal would follow. And that was just me with my mouse dragging it back and forth so that way I could draw in the automation. Moving on to I Don't Trust Myself. This one was particularly fun for me because I got to use the archetype Corey Wong's Postal Service pedal. This one was actually really, really challenging, and this took me a little bit to dial in the specifics, because if you dial in your sensitivity or your range wrong or your attack, you're not going to get that dynamic kind of play with the guitars as the envelope opens up and closes. Now, to make my DIs a little bit more consistent so that way the envelope only opened up on certain notes, I did pull up, again, the Cornef Audio's Pawn Shop compressor just to kind of level out the DIs just a little bit. You can hear the envelope opens up on this initial note and then sort of opens up a little bit later on, but if I turn this off, it's going to be a lot more dynamic. So mainly I'm just using this to level off the dynamics so that way it plays with the envelope filter as I want it to. So taking a look at the first lead in I Don't Trust Myself, I'm again using the Postal Service. So you can hear that I'm getting a lot of the saturation from the Big Rig Overdrive. The head is the clean machine with the first cabinet. I do have a little bit of delay, a little bit of the wash active, mostly just to give it a little bit of space. But the Postal Service is really the crux of this tone. So you can see even just bumping the range knob just a little bit drastically changes the way that the envelope filter interacts with the sound. And same thing with sensitivity. You're going to want to play around with the sensitivity knob to find that exact level at which this is going to start playing with your signal the way you want it to sound. So you can hear with the dial at about 9 o'clock position, it's giving me just enough play so the envelope filter pushes up just a little bit and comes right back down. It doesn't open up all the way because that's not the tone that I'm looking for. Now the lead in this track I found was probably one of the most fun to learn for me personally. Had some really, really great licks. Taught me a lot about using my fingers for picks instead of using picks for my leads. It totally changes the way the transient is shaped, and I really enjoyed the experience of kind of educating myself in that sense. So this one I did record on my Strandberg, so I ended up bumping up the tone on the 4th position compressor, bumping up the tone on the Big Rig overdrive, and using the amp snob as my main tone. But here's the thing that I'm really excited about. Halfway through working through this track, I actually wanted to see if I could use the archetype Cory Wong's DI Funk console more as a channel strip than as an amplifier. Considering that this head is built off of some of Cory's favorite aspects of an SSL console or a Neve console, I figured, why not give it a shot? So you can see I only have the head active. Now let's go ahead and listen to it without, and then I'll turn it back on so you hear how it's processing the signal. So I went with some slow compression just to keep that consistent solo sound, use a little bit of tube saturation, and then used a little bit of boosts on the highs and the mids and dropped a little bit of the lows. So I ended up getting a little bit more consistent, a little bit brighter sound out of this, and I really enjoyed using this as a channel strip. Okay, so we are finally at Slow Dancing in a Burning Room. Let's look at this initial solo because I did something a little bit differently with this particular track. Now, I actually didn't use the delay and the reverb that are within the archetype Cory Wong. I actually made a send to a different aux, so that way I could try and recreate that spring reverb sound that's inherent in the track. So to quickly go over the tone, there's not really a whole lot that's different about this. I used the clean machine, did a little bit of EQ to drop out some of the lows, and then ribbon 121, dynamic 57. But let's take a look at the aux channel. So I started off with the archetype Nolly. I turned on the compressor, backed off the level a little bit, and then I have the initial delay on with a very short 115 millisecond time. Then it goes directly into the delay 2, which is full mix and has 1/64th or 45 milliseconds time delay. So to make all of the various reflections from the delay pedals I used prior, I turned on the compressor pedal in the archetype Plini to kind of even out the dynamics of those and make the delay trail off a little bit more naturally. I went over to the reverb pedal. The dry wet knob is almost full, and let's go ahead and listen to that. And then finally, again, I'm using the Cornef Audio Pawn Shop compressor. It's one of my favorites right now. I'm really enjoying it, just to level off that compression and make it a little bit traily. So to demonstrate the steps and what I was listening for, I'm gonna go ahead and mute the delays and reverbs, and then I'll add in just the archetype Nolly, then the Plini, and then compressor. So now we get to Slow Dancing in a Burning Room's melody line. This was another one where I had to work on my right hand so that way I could get my thumb technique to make the transient how I wanted it to sound. Initially, I was thinking maybe I was gonna have to use a slide for this, or maybe they actually used a pedal steel guitar, but I feel like I was able to mimic the sound pretty well with just recording my Strandberg and then plucking with the soft portion of my thumb. Now, I didn't really want to have a delay. I made a very short delay, 112 milliseconds, so that way I could get a little bit more of a chorusing kind of effect with the delay pedal. And then finally, Slow Dancing in a Burning Room's final lead track, I went with the amp knob because I needed a dirty kind of sound, which this absolutely delivered. You can see by the 4th position compressor, I darkened up the tone, and then I pulled up the amp knob, turned on the drive, and then backed off the volume so that way I wouldn't get so much distortion out of it. I made some adjustments to the EQ, and then used the Ribbon 121. It's a great impulse response for this. And then I used some delay and some reverb as well. Now you'll notice that I did far less as far as EQ and compression in this mix compared to some of the other metal mixes, but when you have some really great tones to begin with, you don't really have to shape them too terribly much or process them a whole lot to get them to fit in the mix as you need them. Like with the bass tracks, I ended up using the amp tone just because it sounded great, made some minor adjustments. Same thing with the guitar tracks, the Corey Wong, the Fort and Cali, the Pliny, they all have really amazing sounds for this style, so I really didn't have to do a whole lot to make these tones work in the mix. So that is how I dialed in the guitar tracks for John Mayer's Artist Tones Top 5 cover. Now, if you have an artist or a guitar player that you want to see me cover on this channel, go ahead and leave them down in a comment below. And don't forget to download the presets, they're in the description box, and let me know what you think of them. Thank you so much for checking out this video. Please leave a like, share, comment, subscribe, and hit that bell icon for notifications on when we upload new content to this channel. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.